Only several hundred years ago, this continent was unsettled by the likes of humans, elves, gnomes, halflings, or dwarves. It took a period of rapid exploration for the unpierceable tides of the Azure Deep to finally be able to be conquered through fleets of 100-man ships. These were young sailors leaving their families and friends behind for an opportunity to be the first to tread their boots across oaken decks and upon the shores of newfound lands. But what awaited them on the other side was more than what any of them could have bargained for. Monsters, strange races, and most importantly, magic. These newly discovered lands contained arcane powers, the likes of which were unheard of back home. Hungry for the opportunity to expand his reach and to conquer these newfound powers, the king, a high elf, sent his son to lead the exploration efforts within his new territory. It didn't take long until a reputation of lawlessness and infighting made its way back home. Every tavern had a bard singing the tales of sorcerers driven mad in their pursuits of ancient arcane secrets, and the walls of every gnomish child's bedroom heard the whispers of savage, green-skinned orcs gnawing on the bones of those who misbehaved. These violent tales of sword and sorcery soon earned this new continent its name of the Blade. Outrage and protest began to fill the streets back home, with cries against the atrocities of magic and the dangers of these newfound monsters. However, that debate was cut short by the appearance of colossal leviathans emerging from beneath the waves of the Azure Deep. Entire ships were swallowed whole inside the twisting maws of scaled beasts who disappeared back into the dark depths of the sea just as quickly as they had appeared. No longer would any man dare to risk the voyage across the sodden midnight abyss. To those trapped on the Blade, this was now their home. Thrust onto the throne of this new land, the elven prince ascended to his role as king, ruling over man and monster alike. With no way back, he pushed further into the great unknown, across its rolling hills and towering forests, until he could go no further. Setting his flag down upon snow-swept peaks, it was here in which his frozen palace would stand. Over time, his pursuit of the arcane arts grew, believing that they were the key to his people's return to their home. An uneasy peace between the races of the New and Old Worlds was upheld for nearly 200 years. During this time, however, many stuck with their othering ways. They kept those unfamiliar to them at an arm's length, well out of sight. Dreams of unity were crushed under these acts of prejudice, though the beating of the drums of rebellion remained soft for the time being. Soon enough, the king fathered an heir of his own, a daughter. Kept away from the dangers of the Blade, she was raised in the safety of her father's care among the forlorn peaks from which he ruled. In her seclusion, she daydreamed of a prince who would guide her across the lands over which her father ruled, to explore as the generations before her had. Her imaginary prince soon came to reality in the form of a dwarven blacksmith's apprentice by the name of Troth, the soon-to-be unfortunate martyr and catalyst for change in this kingdom. His proposal for marriage to the High Elf Princess sparked a burning fury deep within the king. Troth was captured during the night and unceremoniously executed on the floor of the throne room. Some argued that the king had been driven insane by magic sickness, that his fascination with the arcane had pushed him to madness. Others, however, postulated that the dwarven boy was perhaps a separatist spy and that his slaying was necessary to quell the stirring of a slumbering revolution. Or perhaps the dwindling number of high elves and the fading purity of their bloodlines weighed on the king's mind. Regardless, the news of his brutal act spread, and its shockwaves emanated throughout the kingdom, rousing a bitter division that had been growing since man's arrival in these new lands. The dwarves were not a race to take a personal slight against them lightly. Under a banner of equity and reform, they emerged from their mountain homes in the northeast and moved across the Blade, gaining support in the form of the downtrodden, the tieflings and orcs, the bugbears and goblins. In their warpath, villages were crushed or assimilated into their efforts for a revolution. The loyalists who stood to defend the king who had wronged them were slaughtered where they stood. Forced from their homes, many who had lived rural lives fled to the safety of the larger cities, abandoning farmsteads and storefronts in the process. As their blood-covered bootprints began to stain the once pure snow of the mountains from which the king had reigned, their campaign neared its conclusion. It wasn't without a fight. Unleashing the arcane powers which the king had so sought throughout his life, his men rained acid and flames upon those who stepped towards them. Suffice to say, the vengeful horde was not left calm by the sight of the bubbling flesh and seared corpses of their brethren, and instead pressed onwards. When the king was finally captured, no words were spoken. His throat was slit and his blood was spilled across the same stone as the dwarven blacksmith before him. From their pain and losses, the dwarves and races of these new lands birthed the beginnings of a nation, built on the ideals of equal opportunity and freedom for all who stood with them. Troth. Now, 7 years after the revolution's conclusion, several factions have formed in the kingdom's wake. Troth has continued to spread its influence in the Blade, funneling resources from across the continent towards its capital city. The Union, a collection of 5 cities, served as a magical enclave and safe haven for builder species in Genasi during the onslaught of the rebellion. The Fleetlands is home to those who fled their farms and fishing villages on the shores and were forced outwards onto the floating cities of the Azure Deep. The deserts of the Red Dunes have been all but unimpacted by the atrocities of the war, though few dare to brave them without a guide. And finally, the Lord's Land, a collection of resource-rich lands ruled by the Redford family and their vast, vast fortune. It is here in which you find yourself, in the frozen town of Promise. A call for adventures by Lady Redford seeking to end the village's unending winter has brought you to this wasteland, whether in search of fame, fortune, or just for an opportunity to escape from your past.